Hi guys, my name is Julianne from Kullaloo and today we're sewing a hobby horse together. Maybe you already know our other video about sewing a hobby horse, which is about the pattern called Holly. Today we're sewing a different pattern. It's called Hobby Horse Hope, and that's the hobby horse sewing pattern you can find in our book, My Hobby Horse and Me. And we also have that as a paper pattern. So the difference between the two patterns is the way the gusset is sewn in, but also Hope has these sewn in 3D nostrils, how I call them. So we thought we're gonna make an extra video and show you how we do that. And I would say, let's get started.
First, let me show you everything you'll need for your hobby horse. You'll definitely need a main fabric. I'm using our super soft shorty, which is a very short pile minky plush fabric. It's super soft and has this slight sheen to it, just like real horse fur. It also has a nap direction, so you can actually brush it when you groom your horse. In my opinion, it's the perfect fabric. We also have special hobby horse fabrics where the coat colors like a dapple gray or an Appaloosa are already printed on the fabric. I link those for you in the captions because they are also a great option. Next, you'll need some yarn. Personally, I really like a chunky merino yarn. It feels wonderfully soft, and since it's nice and thick, you don't need too many strands to create a full voluminous hobby horse mane. Then you'll need some cord. I usually go with the rope in the same color or similar shade as the main fabric. This will be wrapped around the stick opening of the fabric to hide the edge and give it extra stability. Paracord works best because it's very strong, but you could also use wool if that's what you have on hand. For the facial features, you'll need black felt for the eyes and, if you're not sewing 3D nostrils, for the nostrils as well. I also like to use a bit of white embroidery floss to stitch a little sparkle into the eyes if you don't want to paint them. For attaching the mane, I use black embroidery thread. And to make sewing on the eyes easier, I recommend double-sided fusible webbing like Heat and Bond or Bonder web. That way you can first iron on the felt pieces in place before stitching them down. Alternatively, you can also do the eyes with an embroidery machine or a cutting machine, in which case you don't need the felt or the fusible webbing. I also use a medium weight fusible interfacing to reinforce the main fabric and give the hobby horse a bit more structure. This step is optional, but it does make the horse sturdier. And of course, you'll need fiberfill for stuffing, and last but not least, a broomstick. Here I'm using a broomstick cut in half, which works perfectly for the hobby horse. Before I cut out my fabric pieces, I'm first fusing some interfacing to the entire fabric. This step isn't absolutely necessary, but it gives the horse more stability. I'm also using a very dark fabric here, and with the lighter interfacing on the back, it's much easier for you and me to see the wrong side of the fabric and all the markings. If you don't want to reinforce the whole fabric, I'd at least recommend adding interfacing to the ears and the inner muzzle piece. That way, the ears will stand up better and the inner muzzle won't stretch when stuffed. But if you don't have interfacing at home, you can leave it out completely. Before tracing the pattern, I punched through all the little crosshair markings so I can transfer them accurately onto the fabric. For my horse, I'm going to sew the version with the sewn-in 3D nostrils. If you'd like to applique the nostrils or use an embroidery machine instead, you'll need to trim off this little horn-shaped bulge from the paper pattern piece. Then you'll trace and cut the fabric without the horn. But make sure to keep the paper piece you trimmed off. If you later want to make the 3D version, you can just tape it back on. Now I can trace the pattern pieces onto the wrong side of the fabric. Make sure you also transfer all the markings. For the muzzle opening, connect this endpoint of the muzzle incision with this mark along the fabric edge. Pay attention that some edges, like here at the gusset, don't need any extra seam allowance. For the forehead gusset, there are two different versions. I'm using the one for the 3D nostrils. If you're sewing applique nostrils or using the embroidery files, you need the other forehead gusset piece. Now I can cut out all the traced pieces. And here's an important step. Don't forget to cut along this line for the muzzle opening, from the fabric edge all the way to the end of the line. Next, I'm going to add some shading to my horse. Since I'm sewing a black horse, I can't just paint the darker areas with a darker fabric paint like I did on this horse here. Instead, I have to think the other way around. All the areas that appear lighter here, I need to paint lighter on my black horse. Same goes for the other spots, like these here. Around the eyes, I'll also add a bit of a lighter paint, and here as well. That way, you get the illusion that areas like around the muzzle or the jawline are darker, even on a black horse. To do that, I'm mixing a gray tone from textile paint. Pure white would be too bright, so gray works much better for shading. Now I take a small sponge, dip it into the fabric paint, and dab the paint onto the fabric. Then I blend it out with the sponge until I get a nice soft transition between the paint and the fabric. You can also dampen the sponge with a bit of water to make the blending easier. There's a separate video where I show you the shading process in detail. I link that for you up here if you'd like to watch it. I do the same with the earpieces. Instead of making the inner part darker, I simply highlight the outer edge with a bit of gray paint. I also use this technique on the blaze piece. For that, I want a soft pinkish gradient at the lower edge to imitate the bare skin areas around a horse muzzle. I dab on a little pink fabric paint and blend it with the sponge until it fades softly into the fabric. Now I let everything dry thoroughly before moving on. Next, I'm tracing the eyes and, if you're doing applique nostrils, the nostrils too, onto the heat and bond. Place the heat and bond with the rough side down over the template. Pick the eye shape you like and trace the outlines. Normally, I'd also trace one of these blaze templates, but today I'm sewing a custom horse based on a real one. So instead, I'm sketching the blaze shape by hand. To do this, I tape a piece of heat and bond onto the forehead gusset just to get the right size, and then I draw the blaze freehand. Now I iron the roughly cut out heat and bond with the eye outlines onto black felt. You do the same with the nostrils if you're appliquing them. Here I have my shaded blaze fabric and the blaze shape drawn onto heat and bond. I've used that to the wrong side of the fabric piece. Then I cut out the eyes and the blaze along the drawn lines. Next, I'll add details to the eyes. You could also embroider them by hand. That's something I'll show you later. For painting, there are different templates to choose from. I picked this one here and will paint it onto the felt eyes. For now, I'm using acrylic markers because the paint isn't as strong. Later, I go back over the white highlights with real fabric paint. That way they stand out much more and really shine. To make sure the eyes end up in the exactly right spot, I cut the eye shapes and nostrils, if you're using them, out of the paper pattern. Here's the head side fabric. Now I place the paper template on the right side of the fabric, peel the backing off the heat and bond, and position the eye in the cutout section of the paper template. I press it down with my finger and then carefully remove the paper template. Now I can fuse the eyes with the iron. You'd follow the exact same steps for the applique nostrils. If you're using a lighter fabric, you could also mark the placement with a washable fabric marker, but on black fabric like mine, it wouldn't show. I do the same for the blaze. Peel off the backing, place it on the fabric, and press it in place. I also like to press it from the wrong side of the fabric because minky can be heat sensitive and the fibers can get damaged. From the back I can press a bit longer without burning the pile. Now I sew the eyes in place. Since I've reinforced the fabric with fusible interfacing, I don't need any stabilizer on the back. But if you skip the interfacing, I'd recommend adding a piece of tearaway embroidery stabilizer behind the eyes so the fabric doesn't distort while sewing. I sew around the eyes with a straight stitch, right along the felt edge. At the beginning and end of the seam, I leave the thread tails long, pull them to the back and tie them off. I sew the blaze the same way. For mine, I used our shorty minky, and since the edges of minky don't fray, a straight stitch works perfectly. That's especially helpful here because a straight stitch is much easier to sew around complex shapes like this blaze. But if your blaze fabric does fray, then you'll want to use a zigzag stitch instead. After sewing, I use a needle to fluff out the pile along the seam, which makes the stitching almost invisible. Of course, that only works if you're using a plush fabric with some pile. If you're using a flat fabric like cotton, it doesn't make sense. If you didn't paint the eye highlights, now is the time to add them by hand with white embroidery floss. Just make several stitches right next to each other until you get a dense round dot. Finally, because black eyes are hard to see against black fabric, I'm going to outline them lightly with a silver acrylic marker. And that's it, the eyes and blaze are finished. Next, we'll move on to sewing the gusset pieces together. Here you can see the 3 gusset pieces that we have to sew into one long gusset. I start by sewing the main gusset to the lower gusset, right sides facing, along this edge here. This is where the H marks are, and down here is the opening for the stick. Now I sew the 2 gusset pieces together along the pinned edges. This is what it looks like once sewn. At the inner corners, I trim into the seam allowance up to just before the seam, so the fabric will turn more easily later. Here are the 2 gusset pieces joined together. Now I need to add the forehead gusset at the top, where the A mark is, again right sides facing. I pin and sew the forehead gusset to the main gusset along the marked edge. And this is what the finished gusset looks like. From the 3 pieces, we now have one long gusset. Before attaching it to the head, I still need to add the base thread for the mane. On the main gusset, there's a small marking for the starting point. Since my yarn is way too thick to thread through a needle, I'm using embroidery floss instead, about 16-inch long. It's important that this base thread is the same color as your main yarn, otherwise it will be visible later. I thread the embroidery floss onto a hand needle, not the end, and then stitch it from the wrong side through to the right side at the marking. To keep the base thread from getting caught in the seams, I tape it down with a bit of tape. That way, it won't accidentally slip into the seam while sewing. I do the same for the forelock. For that, I need a small loop instead of a long thread. Again, I thread some embroidery floss on a needle. And now I stitch it through the seam between the main gusset and the forehead gusset, just off center. I bring the needle back down right next to it, leaving about 1/4 of an inch space, so it creates a loop about 1 inch long. Then I knot the thread ends on the seam allowance at the back. I tape this loop down as well so it doesn't get caught into a seam later. Okay, just to make it clear, I'm showing this step again with the contrasting thread color. You can see it better than in black. So, stitch into the seam, form a loop about 1 inch long, stitch back out with about 1/4 of an inch distance, knot the ends, and tape the loop down. Now it's time to join the gusset and the head side pieces. Here's what one finished head side looks like. The first thing we need to do is to sew this dart at the top. This gives the head more shape. To do that, fold the fabric so the edges line up and the marked dart tip sits right on the fold. Pin it in place and sew it down, making sure to sew exactly up to the dart tip and let the seam taper off to a point. Repeat the same step for the second head side. Now I can pin the gusset to the first head side. Before that, I need to snip into the gusset here at the B mark, just up to the mark, on both sides. That will make it easier to join gusset and head later. Next, I pin the gusset to the head side at the B mark and the C mark. To get them really accurate, I stick a pin straight through the B mark on the gusset and then through the B mark on the head side. Pin it firmly in place. I do the same with the C mark. From the back it looks like this. Now I continue pinning all the other points together. The D marks, the E marks of both pieces, the head dart seam with the seam between the forehead gusset and the main gusset. Spread the seam allowances open here. Then the F mark, the G mark, the seam between the main gusset and the lower gusset to the H mark on the head side, then the eye mark, and finally the J marks of both pieces. Again, I use the pin through method to check that they line up perfectly. Once all those points are matched, I pin the entire fabric edge between B and J. I pin my needles at right angles to the edge with the pin head sticking out. That way, when I sew from the head side, I can easily pull the needle pins out or even sew over them if needed. Now I start sewing exactly at the J mark and sew up to the B mark. I recommend sewing with the head fabric on top, not the gusset, so you can follow the curves more easily. Stop with the needle down exactly at the B mark. Then lift the presser foot, adjust the gusset and head fabric edges so they line up exactly, and sew along the straight edge up to the muzzle opening. I've now sewn the gusset to the head side up to the J mark. Before I continue, I snip into the head side fabric just before the J mark so I can spread the fabric better around that corner. Now I pin the lower part of the gusset to the head side, starting with the K mark. Then L, then M, and finally the muzzle opening with the end of the gusset so all edges line up. Then I pin the entire section between J and the muzzle opening. Thanks to the little snip at J, the fabric spreads apart nicely and it's easier to pin. Now I sew from the muzzle opening back to J, stopping exactly at the J mark. Again with the head fabric on top. That completes the gusset on one side. Make sure to double check this tricky J corner. Sometimes not all layers get caught in the seam the first time. Don't worry if you need to go back and reinforce it. It doesn't have to look perfect, it just needs to be secure. This is one of the trickiest spots to sew because of the sharp inner corner. Now I attach the second head side in the same way. I pin everything from the B mark to the J mark and then I pin the rest. This time I leave a turning opening at the back. Then I sew again from the J mark up around to the B mark, stop there, adjust the edges, and continue to the muzzle opening. Just like before, I snip into the fabric near J to help spread the seam. Next, I pin K, L, M, and the muzzle opening to the lower gusset edge and sew from J to the muzzle opening. Again, check this corner at J and make small corrections if needed. That's completely normal. It's a very tricky spot. It doesn't have to be pretty, it just has to hold well. And with that, the gusset is fully sewn in. Next, we'll move on to the inner muzzle piece. To sew the inner muzzle piece into the muzzle opening, place the inner muzzle piece right side down into the opening and pin the center of its lower edge to the center mark of the lower gusset. To make sewing easier, I'm going to secure these two corner points, the ones on the head and on the inner muzzle, together with a bit of sewing thread. This is just a helper stitch to keep everything from slipping when we sew. I thread a needle, go in at the corner point on the head side, pull through, and then go through the matching point on the inner muzzle from the right side to the wrong side. Pull the thread tight so both points align exactly. Then stitch back right next to it and knot the ends. Repeat the same step on the other side. Now I can pin the rest of the inner muzzle edge to the opening, making sure the seams of the gusset line up with the markings on the muzzle piece. It should now look like this. Now sew from one corner point to the other with the smallest seam allowance possible. Here's how it looks sewn in. Check carefully that you really caught the corner points. I had to go back and re-sew here a little to get it right. Then snip into the head side fabric just up to but not through the start and end of the seam. Now pull the upper part of the inner muzzle outward. Then pin the top center of the muzzle piece to the center of the forehead gusset. and then pin the corner points and the remaining fabric edge up to where the previous seam starts and ends. Sew again from corner to corner with a very small seam allowance. The corners can be a bit tricky, so make sure to check from the wrong side that everything is sewn securely. If needed, you can always hand stitch a few spots afterwards to make sure it holds. Here, for example, you can see I didn't catch the seam perfectly at one corner. So I lay the fabric flat, pin again, and sew another short seam along the edge to secure it properly. If, like me, you've sewn the version with the 3D nostrils, now we'll add the nostril shaping threads. For this, thread a hand sewing needle with thread to match the color of your horse. Knot the end and stitch from the wrong fabric side through the nostril mark. Pull the needle through the turning opening and remove it. Do the same on the other side. These threads will later help to pull the nostrils inward for a more realistic shape. For now, just leave them hanging. Next, trim into the seam allowances and then you can turn the horse right side out. I've turned mine, shaped the seams, and now I'll temporarily sew the muzzle edges together with a contrasting thread. This keeps the opening from stretching while stuffing, and later I can easily remove it again. With the muzzle secured, I can start stuffing now. I only stuffed the head for now, about up to here, because we'll still need to insert the stick later. Here's a tip for the 3D nostrils. I like to place a pen or pencil inside each nostril to give it shape while I stuff around it. Here's a tip. Take your time stuffing the muzzle. If you see little wrinkles forming here in the fabric, that means there isn't enough filling. Add more stuffing until those folds disappear. For the inward nostril fabric, I always make sure it lies flat against the head side fabric. And then I only stuff the space in between the nostrils. You can see here at the front, there's not enough filling yet. It still looks wrinkly, so I'll add more stuffing until it's nice and smooth. Now let's prepare the stick. I'm using a broomstick about 24 inches long. I just sawed a regular broom handle in half and sanded the edges smooth. To keep the stick from shifting inside the horse, we'll build a padded plug. For that, I spread glue about 4 to 6 inches up from the end of the stick. Then wrap a big handful of stuffing around it. It works best if the stuffing comes in sheet layers instead of fluffy bits, but both can be used. Now take a rope or cord and wrap it tightly around the stuffing, pulling it snug until you have a solid, even plug. Now this plug goes inside the horse. First, insert the stick through the turning opening and then guide it through the stick opening. Now carefully pull the fabric over the plug, a little at a time. The padded end should sit about halfway between the horse's chin and the top of the head. Adjust it so it's in the right place and then stuff the rest of the head firmly around the stick. Once the head is fully stuffed, close the turning opening at the back with a ladder stitch. Then remove the temporary stitches from the muzzle so it can open and close naturally. Now we can shape the 3D nostrils. Thread one of the helper threads onto a needle and stitch from the nostril into the head and out into the muzzle area and pull gently. This draws the nostril inward and gives it more definition. Compare here. You can see the nostril looks flatter without it and fuller once pulled in. Repeat the same for the second nostril. Then tie the two threads together inside the muzzle, secure the knot, and trim the ends. Finally, to hide the stick opening and secure the fabric edge, wrap a cord or rope tightly around it. I sewed the beginning of the rope in place on the fabric, though you could glue it too. Then I keep wrapping firmly, adding glue bit by bit as I go. Once I reach the end, I drill a small hole in the stick just below the fabric edge and tuck the rope end inside to finish neatly. Next, we can sew and attach the ears. Here's what they look like with the fabric paint dried. Now I can place each ear front side, right sides together with the back side and pin them in place. Now I sew around the edges, leaving the bottom edge open for turning. After sewing, I trim into the seam allowance and then turn the ears right side out. Here's a finished ear. At the open edge, I fold the seam allowance inward, so the raw edge is hidden. Then I fold the ear in half like this. This is the shape we want. Now I sew along the bottom edge to hold it closed. I'm using contrasting thread here so you can see it in the video, but ideally you'd use a thread in the same color as your horse so the stitches disappear. Now it's time to attach the finished ear to the head. The bottom edge of the ear goes to the bottom tip of the dart. Make sure that the inner curve of the ear points towards the middle of the head. I start by stitching into the dart seam, right at the lower third, and come out exactly at the dart tip. The knot will later be hidden underneath the ear. Then I stitch into the center of the ear's bottom edge and pull the thread through. From there, I sew the ear in place with a few stitches, first along the bottom edge, then along the front side. Here's a tip: don't pull the thread too tight right away. It's easier to place your stitches loosely first and then tighten the thread afterwards. Now the bottom edge of the ear is secured. Next, I sew along the front edge of the ear, about halfway up. From there, I stitch through to the back, add a couple of stitches to secure it well, and knot the thread behind the ear. I repeat the same process for the second ear. And that's it. Both ears are attached. Now all that's left is the mane. Here's the yarn I'll be using for the mane. I personally really like chunky yarn, but it's just my preference. You could also use mohair yarn or any other yarn you have at home. Now we need a lot of strands. To cut them quickly, I wrap the yarn many times around the book, then cut it along one side. That way you get a whole bunch of strands in one go. Since these strands are shorter, I'll use them for the forelock. For the mane, I'll cut longer strands, so this time I wrap the yarn around the long side of the book and cut it there. Alright, so these will be the main strands and I need quite a few more. Now that all the strands are cut, I can attach them. Here's the base thread I added earlier to the horse. First, I remove the tape holding it. To make things easier to see in the video, since black on black is hard to follow, I pin a sheet of white paper behind it. Before tying on the strands, I add a helper thread. I stitch it in exactly where the base thread comes out. I'm using a contrasting color here so you can see it, but ideally you'd use the same color as your mane. This helper thread lets me sew the knots down one by one, so the base thread doesn't dangle loose. Now I take the first strand of yarn, fold it in half to make a loop, and place it under the base thread. Pull the two ends through the loop and tighten the knot. Flip it down, slide it up to the top, and then use the helper thread to stitch the knot to the fabric. Make a loop with the helper thread, pull it tight, and it's secured. Then I take the second strand, fold it, knot it onto the base thread the same way, slide it up, and stitch it down with the helper thread. Be sure to knot off the helper thread every so often. If it ever breaks, you don't want to lose all your work. That's happened to me before, and trust me, you don't want to start over. Also, make sure you're sewing the mane right along the center of the gusset. I keep repeating this process until the mane is as long as I want it, usually down to about here. Once finished, I knot and secure both the helper thread and the base thread. I attach the forelock the same way. Here's the little loop we added earlier between the ears, and I knot the short strands onto it using the same technique as for the mane. Once all the strands are on, I shape the loop into a triangle, longer across between the ears, then tapering down to a point on the forehead. I stitch it in place like this. Now I just brush the strands forward and trim them a little. And that's it! Your hobby horse is finished. I hope you had fun sewing along with me. Thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss the next project. Happy sewing and see you next time!